How not to talk about Mary Esabel Valverde's music, a trans-Indigenous Mexican composer's perspective. On April 29th, 2021, Coral Commons posted an episode of their Engender podcast consisting of an interview with transgender Indigenous Mexican composer Mary Esabel Valverde. This is an excerpt.
Can we talk about how making these changes is the only honest option? It is the most radically honest option, and that it's not about right versus left. It's not about, rural versus urban. That really, it's just how honest are we willing to be about our own humanity as we proceed in our choral practice.
Oh, Mari, you have so much to contribute to this conversation, and we're so lucky to have you. And I love the idea of beginning from humanity, because that's really what it is all about, right? That's what we're all searching for in this profession, is how do we articulate what it means to be human?
And it's also, when we talk about marginalization, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's really, I posted on Facebook this morning about a Black trans woman who was murdered. She was stabbed to death at a vigil.
Earlier in the interview, Valverde had been speaking of systemic racism and how race is a human rather than political issue. As the interviewer seemingly failed to pick up on Valverde's emphasis, she interrupted him to redirect the conversation. This tendency of folks to speak over QT BIPOC people is unfortunately as common in non-academic as well as academic contexts. Earlier this year, I had reached out to Valverde about creating a composer profile for her on my Global Musical Modernism's website, and she kindly provided some input about how she has been held back as a composer by the values of a white, cisgender, male-dominated field. Valverde is one of 13 transgender composers in the US, according to the Institute for Composer Diversity website. I first learned about transgender issues from one of the would-be original contributors, Sarah Marie Schoenhoven, in my edited volume Queer Ear. She spoke to me about how the composer Wendy Carlos was insistent that writers should focus on her music rather than her transgender identity. Later on, Schoenhoven withdrew from our book due to health reasons. I was glad for that earlier exchange, because for a BIPOC cis gay man like me to conduct research on BIPOC lesbians and trans women is to speak outside of the body and subjectivity that I inhabit. However, we also cannot leave the labor of amplifying BIPOC lesbian and trans women voices to just those marginalized groups. Taking a page from ethnomusicologists, what we should be doing is to engage in collaborative research practices. On this note, I'm happy to see that some university presses are preparing author guidelines on extractive ethnography and citational justice. In my research, I'm guided by the literature in transgender theory and transgender musicology that interrogates the concept of queering. While queering retains its counter-hegemonic anti-normative potential, as seen in every chapter of Queer Ear, there are also some cases when queering is inappropriate. Transgender Musicology by Goldin Perschbacher, Pennington, and especially Bates has articulated how an emphasis on queering in the sense of gender fluidity or cross-gender identification can actually occlude the fact that the desire for cisgender passing has implications for trans people's safety and survival, where gender non-conformity makes one a target for violence. In addition, trans music makers do not necessarily identify as gender fluid, and those who do identify as such do not necessarily express this fluidity in their music. The spectacularization of trans people's gender is something Schoenhoven and Carlos found invasive and inappropriate. It should not be the case that we selectively focus on just trans people who fit specific ethical tenets with musicological value, such as queering, excluding those who don't. In that vein, Emi Koyama has criticized how intersex people have become valuable fodder for feminist theory, but what is needed above academic representation is actual assistance and advocacy for intersex people subject to unnecessary surgery. In the future of queer and trans musicology, there should be space for both queering and for cisgender passing. The crux of the matter is that regardless of how they identify, trans people are always going to be different from cisgender people, including cis gays and lesbians, because of the oppression that they've faced. If we remember that, we might be less likely to confuse trans people's need for passing with the stereotyping of gender roles. Back to Valverde's interview. The interviewer's incomprehension of Valverde's emphasis is reflected in the summary of the interview on the webpage. The summary mentions quote-unquote gender diversity and the quote-unquote humanizing power of representation, whereas as you heard at the end of the excerpt, Valverde was speaking about a black trans woman who was stabbed. The focus on what one of the interviewers called the poetry of Valverde's self-expression erases the violence of transphobia and racism and constitutes a form of white fragility that drowns out QT BIPOC people. The white interviewers extracted what they needed from Valverde, which is the assurance that those white people are gender inclusive. This extractive practice parallels musicologists who take what they need from the trans community, including trans people who express gender nonconformity, and ignoring those who don't. I'd like to turn now to Valverde's choral work, Our Phoenix, which celebrates trans people against the backdrop of horrific violence against trans people, as seen in discrimination and murders leading to suicide attempts by 40% of trans people in the US and an average lifespan of 35 for trans BIPOC people. From its B-flat minor opening, the work moves fluidly to and from the relative major of D-flat, ending triumphantly in the latter key. This excerpt is from the opening of Our Phoenix. And let me do a quick share screen here. A traditional queer reading might extract a hermeneutics of trans-tonal fluidity from this, while criticizing the work for relying on a hoary masculine script of heroic overcoming. As the foregoing has suggested, however, I am of the opinion that this queering reading is not appropriate here. First, there is no indication from Valverde that she identifies as gender fluid. Rather, she acknowledges that she has the privilege of passing as cisgender. Second, rather than remaining in a querying mode that feels the need to counter all narrative scripts as normative, we should recognize that the same narrative in the hands of a white cis male versus a trans indigenous Mexican woman can never mean the same thing. This is an elementary question of contextualization. And another important point is that the tonal relations in the work were articulated by Valverde herself and thus merit investigation using the tools of music theory. To sum up, what is important is not just inclusion, but also the way in which we talk about the people we try to include. In queer and trans music studies, there is room for both queering and cisgender passing. Perhaps only neo-Kantian universalists would insist otherwise. It is critical that in attempts at inclusion, we do not inadvertently become so enamored of our own critical tools, such as queering, that we end up disposing of QT BIPOCs who do not fit into that mold. From transgender musicology, we might learn an ethics of care that is focused on actual people as opposed to what academics think, which tends to diverge from what activists want. As Valverde said in the interview, activists want action. This means providing resources for QT BIPOC people who need them. If you're interested in supporting Valverde, you can send an email to Gavin to 20,000 and let me say that again. Gavin2022ams@gmail.com, and you should get an automated reply with relevant links. Thank you.